At 11:01 on the morning of November 13th, 1942, a signalman on the bridge of the cruiser USS Helena stood with his long glass raised, taking down a message from the cruiser Juneau, letter by letter, across open water. That is the whole trade of a signalman. 2 men, 2 lenses, and light. He could see the sailor he was talking to. The message never got finished. In the middle of it, the man in his lens went into the air. The account he gave afterwards survives in the National Archives, and it does not decorate anything. The Juneau's signalman was blown at least 30 feet into the air. Behind that man, 6,000 tons of warship ceased to exist. Witnesses on the San Francisco said the cruiser broke in two and that both halves were gone within 20 seconds. The smoke column stood 1,000 feet over the sea. Men on the nearby ships thought they were being bombed from high altitude because nothing on the surface of the ocean is supposed to do that. There were 693 men aboard her. Roughly 115 of them survived the explosion. They came up through the oil into an empty morning, and they watched their own task force sail away over the horizon. 8 days later, the United States Navy pulled 10 of them out of the water. 5 of the men aboard that cruiser were brothers, 5 sons of one house in Waterloo, Iowa, and their name will follow this story all the way to its end. The ship died in 20 seconds. Her crew took 8 days. In between those two numbers, there is a message. One line of light, flashed to a passing bomber, acknowledged and never delivered. Nearly every man in this story did nearly everything right. About 100 men died inside that word, nearly. 12 hours before the explosion, Juneau had been through a night battle fought at ranges no cruiser was built for. In the small hours of Friday, November 13th, an American column steamed head-on into a Japanese force off Guadalcanal, and the two formations tangled at distances down to 1,600 yards. A Japanese searchlight snapped on. The leading destroyers opened fire at point-blank range. For about 15 minutes, ships fired into each other in the glare and the dark, sometimes into their own. By morning, the Americans had lost the cruiser Atlanta and 4 destroyers, sunk or sinking. Admiral Callahan, who took the column in, was dead on the bridge of the San Francisco. Admiral Scott was dead on the Atlanta. Command of what remained fell to the senior surviving captain, Gilbert Hoover of the Helena. Hold his name. Everything that follows lands on him. Juneau had taken a torpedo that night on the port side in the forward fire room. Approximately 17 men were inside that compartment. All of them died at once. The hit came in below the armor belt, where a light cruiser is soft, and the shockwave buckled the deck, shattered the fire control computers, and put the lights out. Her chief engineer believed the keel itself had been broken. She did not sink. She settled 10 to 12 feet down by the head and kept her place in the line at 18 knots. Her doctor, listening to the engines, thought it was closer to 20. Even the small numbers of this day refused to agree. So, at dawn on November 13th, a procession of cripples formed up for the run south to the New Hebrides. San Francisco, punished so badly that her surviving officers were commanding from a wrecked bridge. Helena, the least damaged, now the flagship by default. Juneau, down by the head, and 3 destroyers around them, Fletcher, O'Bannon, and Sterrett herself, shot up from the night before. At 7:25 that morning, the formation slowed and a whaleboat crossed from the Juneau to the San Francisco. The flagship of the night battle was full of wounded men and short of people to treat them, so the Juneau sent her doctor, Lieutenant Roger O'Neill, and 3 pharmacists' mates named Merchant, Cecil, and Sims. 4 men left a doomed ship that morning for the best reason in the world, and not one of them knew what they were leaving. The sea around the column was not empty. At 8:15, O'Bannon was detached to run ahead and transmit a message, which thinned the screen to 2 destroyers. At 9:50, Sterrett picked up a sonar contact and rolled depth charges on it. Submarines were following the cripples the way sharks follow blood, and every man on those bridges knew it. The submarine was I-26. Just before 11, she fired a spread of 3 torpedoes at the biggest target in the column, the San Francisco. Not one of them hit the ship they were aimed at. The first crossed ahead of the San Francisco and passed astern of Juneau. The third missed everything. The second torpedo ran deep, passed clean underneath the San Francisco without ever showing a wake, and kept going. Beyond her was Juneau, with a torpedo wound already in her port side. The second torpedo struck her almost exactly on that wound. What it reached was a magazine. The Helena's war diary, kept on Hoover's own bridge, records the day in the bare voice of a logbook. At 1100, torpedo reported on the port side, 400 yards out. 1 minute of warning. At 1101, Juneau, quote, torpedoed, exploded, and disappeared from sight. The San Francisco's official report, written 2 days later, reaches for physics and gives up. The ship, it says, literally disintegrated. One column of brown and white smoke and flame rose, in the report's words, easily 1,000 feet in the air. Pieces of the Juneau fell across the formation. One fragment struck the San Francisco's number 1 gun and put it out of commission. Another broke both legs of a man standing on her deck. And then, from underneath the sea, came a string of muffled detonations, which the report attributes to the sunken sections of the ship, still exploding on the way down. 20 seconds, the witnesses said, then smoke on empty water. Why did nobody warn her? The San Francisco's report answers that question directly, and the answer is the night battle. Her radio transmitter was out. Her signal halyards had been cut. Her flag bags were gutted. Every searchlight but one was wrecked. The ship that saw the torpedo coming had been stripped 12 hours earlier of every means of saying so. Her lookouts believed Juneau never saw the wake until it was about 1,000 yards out. On a broken keel, there was no turn that could save her. Now put yourself on the bridge of the Helena, because for the next 20 minutes, the entire story lives there. Gilbert Hoover has just watched a cruiser vanish. His command is 2 damaged cruisers full of wounded, screened by 2 destroyers, one of them damaged too, in water where a submarine has just fired and a sonar contact was being depth-charged an hour ago. Stopping to search means holding the remaining ships at a crawl over the exact patch of sea the submarine is watching. And there is one more weight on him, which stayed private for years. The captain of the Juneau, Captain Swenson, was one of Hoover's closest friends. When Hoover looked at that smoke, he was looking at the place where his friend had just died. He did not stop. He kept the column moving south. 2 days later, he sat down and wrote his action report, and he built it around the 4 hardest decisions the day had forced on a commander. The 4th one he phrased himself. Before any board of inquiry could phrase it for him, should an attempt have been made to search the area for survivors? His answer is in the file. Given a screen of 2 destroyers, ships crippled and loaded with wounded, and the violence of that explosion, quote, it was not considered that the risk of further torpedoing was justified. No sound contact, no sight contact, and one hope, recorded in the report's own stiff grammar. The hope that a plane would soon appear was held. The plane appeared. At 11:16, a shape came over the horizon, and at 11:21 it was identified as an American B-17. Helena's signal bridge called it in by light, and the text of that message still exists, filed as an enclosure in the National Archives. One line. It said, Juneau torpedoed, disappeared, latitude 1032 south, longitude 161.02 east. And then 5 words, survivors in water, report COMSAPAC, survivors in water, report to South Pacific Command. Hoover put the position, the facts, and the request into the hands of an aircraft whose entire job was to carry information, and the aircraft acknowledged it. His own report recalls what happened next in one devastating clause. The message was, quote, acknowledged for by the plane, but apparently not forwarded. Admiral Halsey, who ran the South Pacific War, put it even shorter in his memoirs. This information never went through. One wrinkle, because the documents deserve to be shown as they are. The Helena's log says 11:01. The message to the bomber says 11:09. 8 minutes of difference that no surviving paper explains. The largest error of this day is still ahead. From the water, the men of the Juneau watched the rescue they assumed was coming. Alan Hayne, a seaman off the Juneau, remembered it in the plainest sentence of the war. You could just see masts going over the horizon, and we thought, well, they know we're here, they'll surely pick us up. They knew, and no one came. Joseph Hartney was a signalman on the Juneau, which on that morning was a job with a detail worth noticing. The night torpedo had cut power to the bridge, so all light signaling was being done from a station aft. When the Helena's signalman watched the Juneau spelling out her message, the light was coming from the after end of a broken ship. At about 11, Hartney stepped toward the door of his signal enclosure. In his own words, there was a terrific explosion. It may have been two explosions. The world went dark, and he believed for a moment that his eyes had been blown out. They had not. What had turned the morning black was fuel oil, thrown so high that it was falling back like weather. It made it seem, he said, like night. Then the ship took him down with her. The suction pulled him so deep that the pressure hurt his skull, held him, and let him go. He came up through the oil. A man was struggling in the water a short distance away, and Hartney swam for him. The suction, he said, got to him before I did. Alan Hayne came to on deck against a gun mount, a steel helmet on his head. Oil coming down out of the sky, so thick he took it for rain. Then he was in the water, and a donut raft, a ring of cork and canvas with a rope net across it, popped up in front of him out of nowhere. He grabbed it. The first man he pulled aboard was a boatswain's mate who worked the ship's post office, crying for help. His leg had been blown off. He could not swim. Through the morning, stragglers kept surfacing and swimming in, and rafts found rafts. By nightfall, 3 donuts had been lashed together, carrying and surrounding a crowd that Hayne put at about 140 men. Remember that number. It is one man's count, made from inside the crowd, and it is the largest count anyone would ever make. Some of those men had arms and legs torn off. One man's skull was laid open so that the men beside him could see inside it. There was almost nothing to treat any of them with. The water burned with fuel oil, which sat in every cut and every pair of eyes, and the men found only one blessing in it. A body soaked in oil holds warmth a little longer at night and burns a little slower in the sun. American aircraft crossed the sky over them all day. B-17S came down low, skimmed the water, and waved. The men in the water waved back and told each other that tomorrow, at the latest, there would be a ship. Of the 5 Sullivan brothers, the record of that first day holds a trace of exactly one. George, the oldest, a gunner's mate second class, was alive on the donuts. The Navy's interviewers would later question every rescued man, and in those interviews no witness places Frank, Joe, Matt, or Al in the water at all. The explosion had almost certainly taken 4 brothers in the first 20 seconds. It had left the 5th to the sea. Somebody had to take charge, and somebody did. Lieutenant Blodgett, the Juneau's gunnery officer, was the senior man in the water. He ordered the donuts secured in a line, one behind another, and the strongest men up onto the leading floats to straddle them and paddle. Land had been visible from the ship when she went down. Blodgett set a course for it and steered at night by the stars. They paddled in shifts, all day and all night. The donuts were built to keep men afloat, not to go anywhere. Hayne's verdict: we didn't seem to be getting anywhere at all. On the 3rd day, an aircraft came low over the rafts and dropped a rubber lifeboat. Hayne remembered the plane as a B-17. Hartney remembered it as a DC-3. Both men remembered the drop itself for the rest of their lives, and the 2 accounts sit side by side in the Navy's own files, disagreeing about the machine and agreeing about the mercy. That is what honest records look like. The boat splashed down a long way off, a fleck of yellow that showed only when it rode up on a wave. 3 or 4 men took a donut and went for it, Hayne and Hartney among them. They got it, inflated it with its chemical tubes, and brought it back, and the party made the obvious decision. The worst of the wounded would ride in it, up out of the water. The worst of the wounded was a lieutenant junior grade named Charles Wang. His leg was broken open, the kind of wound the sea does not forgive. He asked Blodgett for a place in the rubber boat, and Blodgett said yes. Hayne paddled his donut back to the line and took up his old place in the crowd. And then, toward evening, the rubber boat left. There were 3 men in it by then, and they called back to the rafts that they had decided to paddle for land and send help. From the donuts, where dozens of wounded men lay half-submerged, it looked like exactly what it sounds like. Hayne remembered the hollering and the argument and the way the wounded men felt about it. Why should those three go in that rubber raft and leave us here? It looked like we would just be goners that way. The three men were Hartney, Wang, and a seaman named Fitzgerald. Their side of it was arithmetic. The boat could hold a few, the donuts held everyone, and land with help on it was the only version of this that did not end one way. Both sides of that argument were right. The sea builds arguments like that. On the fourth day, the weather made the decision final. The sea got up, the line of donuts came apart, and the rafts lost each other in the wave troughs. On Hayne's donut, there were now about 12 men. Among them, a Polish coal miner from Pennsylvania, a man from Tennessee whose name Hayne could never call back, and George Sullivan. What follows comes from the man who lived it, Seaman Alan Hayne, in a recording the Navy made. The Navy itself warned that his memory was not clean, and we will not pretend otherwise. You will hear exactly how, at the moment, it matters most. But there are pieces of his account that no one disputes, because the sea did the same things to every raft in every ocean of this war. There was a gunner's mate on Hayne's raft named Pogue, wounded, who could not stop swallowing seawater. Hayne held him in his arms, head above the water, for half a day. Toward night, the man's mouth ran yellow, and he stiffened, and Hayne could find no heartbeat at his chest or his wrist. He told the others he was going to let the body go, and George Sullivan said no. "You can't do that," he said. "It's against all regulations of the Navy. You can't bury a man at sea without official orders from some captain or the Navy Department or something like that." Hayne knew the man arguing with him was delirious. He also could not get anyone to take the body from his arms, and no one would overrule George. So, a dead man was held among the living, on a raft already too small for the living, until a shark took the body's leg below the knee. Then they took the dog tag off, said a prayer over him, and let him float away. That was the daylight. The nights had their own economy. Men who had lost their clothes in the explosion froze after dark, so the others huddled them in the middle and held them under the surface, where the water was warmer than the night air. And in the dark, the sharks changed their manner. By day, the men could see them circling, kick at them, splash them away. At night, a drowsing man would simply be seized. The sharks, Hayne said, did not take a man all at once. They took a piece and went away, and came back and dragged him off and drowned him. There was nothing anybody could do but listen. On the fifth day, the sea went flat and the sun came down on them like a verdict. The men without shirts burned until their backs, in Hayne's words, looked as if they had been shaved with a razor, all raw. Thirst was doing its arithmetic. Some men said out loud that they were done trying, and that drowning was a smaller thing than another day of this. That night, after dark, George Sullivan said he was going to take a bath. He took off all his clothes and swam a little way from the donut. He had been 5 days in the water, most of it coated in black oil, and now the oil was off. And Hayne believed it was the white of his body, flashing in the dark water, that brought the shark. "A shark came and grabbed him," Hayne said, "and that was the end of him. I never seen him again." That is the only account of the death of George Sullivan that exists on this earth. One witness. And here is what this channel owes you about that witness. The recording was made in September 1944, almost 2 years afterward. On the title page of the transcript, the Navy's own interviewer wrote a warning where nobody could miss it. He frankly admits he was delirious at times. And in the question period at the end, a lieutenant asks Hayne directly, "When you got on the rescue ship, were you delirious?" And Hayne answers, "Yes, I was." The same interviewer judged the story authentic where it could be checked against the other survivors. Both of those judgments sit in the same file. A man who was honest about his own broken mind, and a Navy that wrote the warning on the cover instead of burying it. You now know exactly as much as the documents allow anyone to know. The raft grew emptier by a man or two a night. A gunner's mate named Stuart became convinced there was a hospital ship lying just under the horizon and swam for it, out into open water, sharks turning after him. While the others screamed at him to come back, he tired, turned, and made it back that time. The conviction did not leave him. A night later, he went again, quietly, and the sharks got him. Toward the end, there were two, Hayne and a young sailor he knew only as a Mexican boy, holding opposite ends of the donut, feet up out of the water to keep them from trailing. Hayne had passed the boy his pocket knife to work on the raft's fraying lashings. In the dark, both men dozed. A shark took the boy's leg, jagged, and the boy, delirious, complained that somebody was stabbing him with a knife. Hayne, delirious himself, spent some unknowable stretch of that night paddling the raft in circles, trying, in his words, to get him to a doctor. Then the boy screamed, and Hayne held his arm, and the shark came up underneath and pulled him down, and Hayne could not hold him. After that, Hayne was alone. By his own count, it was the 9th day. The calendar says the 8th. 8 days in the water had made eventime uncertain. That last morning, he watched sailors climb up out of the sea with rifles on their backs, standing guard duty on the hatches of a ship that was not there. They told him the Juneau was fine, that he could come below and dry off and eat. Twice he swam to them. Twice they vanished as he arrived. Then, he said, my head got clear and something told me just to hang on a little longer. Around noon, a PBY flying boat crossed over him, circled and flew away. He gave up on it. He was a man alone, coated black with oil, indistinguishable from debris. A couple of hours later, the plane came back and dropped smoke bombs around him. And he pulled off his shirt and waved, and the crew waved back. And then the plane went off and hung in the distance, and he understood. It was guiding something toward him. A mast came over the horizon. This one grew larger instead of smaller. And the men in the rubber boat? Their moment had come earlier, on the morning of their 7th day, and it is the finest thing in this whole black story. A PBY was quartering the sea a long way off, too far to notice 3 men in a yellow raft. The paddles that came with the raft were aluminum under their coat of fuel oil. Fitzgerald still had his pocket knife, and Joseph Hartney, signalman 2nd class, a man whose entire profession was making light carry meaning, spent half an hour scraping a paddle blade down to bare metal. Then he stood up in a rubber boat on the open ocean, Fitzgerald holding his leg so he would not fall, and turned the blade into the sun. The PBY saw the flash almost immediately and flew, in Hartney's words, right directly to us. The 3 men reached the small island of Santa Catalina, where islanders took them in and nursed them, and American forces later brought them out. Charles Wang, gangrene in his leg, a pact already agreed among the 3 to amputate if they made land, lived. Hold that image of the paddle. We are not done with it. Now follow the same week through the files, because the documents tell a story that none of the men in the water could see. The cripple column reached Espiritu Santo late in the afternoon of November 14th. Hoover had already raised Admiral Turner by short-range radio that morning and told him about the Juneau. On arrival, he notified Admiral Fitch as well. The official history is blunt about what that means. By November 14th, 1 day after the sinking, South Pacific Command was fully aware. Halsey himself remembered it differently and more personally. In his memoirs, the news arrives as a discrepancy between 2 lists crossing a desk, the ships that fought and the ships that reached port. He turns to his chief of staff and asks, "Where's the Juneau?" And the answer comes back, "I don't know, sir. I'll have to check." Memory compresses. Paper does not. However the word arrived, it arrived within a day. And that is what makes this part of the story the hardest to sit with. Because the Navy did order a rescue. On November 14th, South Pacific Command sent dispatch 142202. The destroyer Meade was to proceed to Juneau's last known position and pick up survivors. Then, the war got in the way. The naval battle for Guadalcanal was still burning, and Meade was rerouted to a shore bombardment. Then, to attack Japanese transports. Then, to pull a downed aircrew out of the sea. On the 15th, Helena sent a formal dispatch, and Meade was ordered out again. She searched through the 16th a full day until weather and low fuel drove her off. Search aircraft kept crossing the area for days. And every one of those days, the men on the donuts were dying at the rate of a few every night. Meanwhile, the paperwork of certainty moved on its own track. Open the San Francisco's action report dated November 15th, written by her acting captain, a lieutenant commander carrying a shattered ship home. Paragraph 1 describes the explosion. Paragraph 2 is a single line. Quote, "It is certain that all on board perished. Nothing could be seen in the water when smoke lifted. It is certain." On November 15th, when that sentence went into the record, roughly 100 men were still alive at 10 degrees south, 161 east. The man who wrote it was not lying. From his wrecked bridge, through that smoke, it was true. He had watched a ship disintegrate and no imaginable physics left survivors. The most dangerous sentences in war are not lies. They are things that are obviously true and false. On November 17th, Admiral Kelly Turner endorsed the report with one word: forwarded. The same day, Lieutenant O'Neill, the Juneau's doctor, sat down aboard another ship and wrote his own account of the loss as her senior surviving officer. He wrote it 3 days before the men in the water were found. Hear that again? The official report of the Juneau's senior surviving officer predates the rescue of the actual survivors. On November 18th, at last, came a sighting from the air, and the rescue, when it finally happened, took 3 shapes in 2 days. On November 19th, a PBY Catalina reached the remnant of the main group and lifted 5 men out of the sea: Zook, Butterfield, Gardner, Holmgren, and Mantere. That same day, on Santa Catalina Island, the 3 men from the rubber boat were already in the hands of the islanders. And a report had come in of a life raft holding 12 survivors, and the ship sent toward it tells you everything about what the South Pacific had left to send. USS Ballard, a seaplane tender, already carrying 21 stretcher cases and 42 walking wounded when she was turned toward the position. Her log for November 20th reads like the last 2 heartbeats of this story. At 0838, rescued friend, AT, Seaman First Class, USS Juneau, service number and all, entered in the log. 2 hours of searching later, at 10:45, rescued Hain, AC, Seaman Second Class. The report had promised a raft of 12. In a full day of searching, the Ballard found 2 men, 10 men out of the water. That was everything the sea gave back. The official list is short enough to say aloud, and they have earned it. Butterfield, Fitzgerald, Friend, Gardner, Hartney, Hain, Holmgren, Mantere, Wang, Zook. And 4 more Juneau men were alive that week because a whaleboat had carried them to the San Francisco on the last morning. O'Neill, Merchant, Cecil, and Sims. 10 survivors of the sinking, 14 of the crew. Lieutenant Blodgett, who lashed the rafts into a line and steered a doomed convoy of donuts by the stars, is on neither list. And 16 days after the sinking, the file itself was corrected in the bluntest instrument the Navy possesses, an endorsement. The San Francisco's report, with its certainty that all aboard had perished, went up the chain, and on November 29th, it came back down wearing a new paragraph, signed W.F. Halsey. Quote, "Paragraph 2 of the basic letter is incorrect. Aircraft subsequently cited approximately 60 survivors in the water at the scene. Of these, several have been rescued and rescue operations are continuing as of date of this endorsement. The same file now holds, it is certain that all on board perished. And, 3 pages later, the commander of the South Pacific calling that sentence incorrect, 16 days on, with rescue operations still running. No historian wrote that correction. The Navy wrote it about itself in November 1942. So how many men were actually in the water? Here are all the numbers that exist, each with its source, because choosing the convenient one is not what this channel is for. Alan Hain, inside the crowd on the first evening, counted about 140. The Navy's historians reconstructing it afterward say approximately 115. Halsey's memoir says some 120. The only number in an official 1942 document is the one you just heard. Approximately 60, counted from the air, days into the dying. And the number nobody disputes is 10. If a man of the Helena, the Ballard, the San Francisco, or the Juneau herself is part of your family's story, his name belongs in the comments under this film. Somebody had to answer for it. Hoover was ordered from Espiritu Santo to Halsey's headquarters at Noumea, where 3 senior officers questioned him: Turner, Fitch, and Calhoun. Halsey's view was specific. Hoover should have thrown an anti-submarine screen around the site, broken radio silence, and begun a rescue. The advisors concluded he had been wrong to sail on. The recommendation was removal from command. Halsey's memoir records his own state with unusual honesty. He believed Hoover was a superb officer. The 3 Navy crosses on his record said as much. But he concluded that, in his words, the strain of prolonged combat had impaired his judgment, that guts alone were keeping him going. And so, quote, reluctantly, I concurred. The books will tell you Hoover was relieved. None of them tells you the date, but the Helena's own war diary does, in the driest possible way. Every day's entry opens with a heading naming the ship's captain. On November 23rd, the heading says Captain G.C. Hoover, and beside it a second name has appeared, Captain C.P. Cecil. From November 24th, the heading carries Captain Cecil alone. Between those 2 routine lines of a logbook, 10 days after the Juneau exploded, 3 days after the last survivors came out of the water, a man handed over his ship and walked off the bridge as the officer who abandoned the Juneau's crew. He carried that name for the rest of the war, and then the man who fired him took it back. Years later, at the urging of an admiral named Carney, Halsey sat down and reviewed the whole case: the submarine contacts, the wounded ships, the 2 destroyer screen, the message handed to the B-17. His conclusion, published in his own memoirs for the whole world, is a sentence almost no commander in any navy has ever written about himself. Quote, I concluded that I had been guilty of an injustice. Hoover's decision, he now judged, had been in the best interests of victory. He informed the Navy Department and asked that Hoover be restored to combat command. And he closed with this: I deeply regret the whole incident. And the bomber. The official history traced the message as far as it could. The B-17 that acknowledged Hoover's signal tried to land at Henderson Field that day and was waved off, and flew on to Espiritu Santo, where the crew put the sinking of the Juneau into their routine report. Routine. For unknown reasons, the record says, it went no further in time to matter. The Navy's file on the loss holds no name for anyone aboard that aircraft, and no inquiry ever hung the failure on a man. The signalman on the Helena's bridge, whose lens this story opened through, is nameless in the file too. The men at either end of the Juneau's last message are anonymous forever, and the failure between them is documented in triplicate. That is the true shape of this catastrophe. Not one villain. A friend who chose the living ships over the dead one. A message that died in the routine paperwork of an exhausted airfield. A rescue ship rerouted 3 times by a battle that refused to end. A report that was certain and wrong, each link defensible, the chain unforgivable. In Waterloo, Iowa, the war had already been personal for a year. 5 brothers had walked into the Des Moines recruiting station together on January 3rd, 1942, a month after Pearl Harbor. 2 of them, George and Frank, had worn the uniform before. Navy practice was to separate family members. The 5 of them refused it, persisted, and won, and went aboard the brand new Juneau together. Al, the youngest, left behind a wife, Catherine, and a son, Jimmy, not yet 2 years old. The Casualty Machinery of 1942 was slow, and rumor was faster. Through the winter, whispers reached Waterloo before the Navy did. The official word came in January 1943. All 5 sons missing in action. Then a letter went out over the signature of Franklin Roosevelt. The president wrote of "your 5 gallant sons," and quoted a line one of the boys had written when they enlisted. We will make a team together that can't be beat. George Thomas, Francis Henry, Joseph Eugene, Madison Able, Albert Leo. The Navy's Bureau of Personnel typed out all 5 service records in one sitting that January. 5 files that end on the same day. You have probably heard what happened next because it is one of the most repeated stories of the war. That the deaths of the 5 Sullivans forced the Navy to create a rule against brothers serving together. Here is what the documents actually say. No Sullivan Act was ever passed by Congress. No president ever signed such an order. And the rule itself already existed. In July 1942, 4 months before the Juneau went down, the Bureau of Naval Personnel published a bulletin stating that brothers should not be put on the same ship in wartime, and ordering commanding officers to stop forwarding requests like the one the Sullivans had made. The bulletin even cited its instance. 3 brothers, lost together on the USS Arizona. The Navy's own historians append one quiet sentence. The rule does not seem to have been enforced in practice. The lesson was already written in the blood of the Arizona's brothers, and 5 more brothers sailed anyway, because a regulation nobody enforces is not a regulation, it is a prophecy. The actual sole survivor policy, the one that sends the last son home, arrived as Circular Letter 345-44 in November 1944. The family did not disappear into its grief. Genevieve, the sister, enlisted in the Naval Reserve, and with her parents went on the road for the war effort through more than 200 plants and shipyards. By January 1944, the 3 surviving Sullivans had spoken to more than 1 million war workers in 65 cities. And in February 1943, the Navy struck the name Putnam from a destroyer under construction and renamed her USS the Sullivans. Later christened her. The ship carried the brothers' own motto on her crest, "We stick together." She earned 9 battle stars in the war her namesakes did not finish, and there has been a USS the Sullivans in the fleet, off and on ever since. The current one was christened by Al's granddaughter. The Juneau herself was found on March 17, 2018, by a search expedition funded by Paul Allen, 13,800 feet down in the waters off the Solomon Islands, broken, as the witnesses said, in 2. Everything you have heard tonight lives in one place, the National Archives. The Helena's log with its 1101 entry, the one-line message to the B-17 in its original typescript, the certainty of November 15th, and its correction 3 pages away. The recorded voices of Hayne and Hartney with the Navy's warnings on their title pages. We went through them page by page. A signalman on the Helena once watched a message from the Juneau die in mid-sentence, 20 seconds before the ship sending it ceased to exist. A week later, a signalman from the Juneau stood up in a rubber boat, held a scraped aluminum paddle into the sun, and sent the last signal any of the Juneau's men would ever send. That one arrived. 10 men lived because light finally carried. 683 men from one cruiser have no grave but the water they waited in. If any of them, or any man of the Helena, the Ballard, the San Francisco, or the PBY cruise, belongs to your family, put his name in the comments. 10 names came out of that water. The rest have only what we remember, and you are part of that now. Thank you for staying with them to the end.